Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all here and be back in action, isn't it? My name's Heather Holst. I'm the Commissioner for Residential Tenancies in Victoria, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this session on private rental this morning with you all. I wish to pay my respects and acknowledgement to the people, the traditional owners on the lands on which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So welcome everybody, and welcome also, sorry, someone having a bit of a convo there, and welcome also to those people joining us by video. Now there is a little bit more tech to this. You will have heard if you're in the first sessions that there's a conference app, and that's actually how we're going to handle the questions too. So we want to make the second half of this session all about the questions. So if you haven't already cracked the code for the app, could you take a minute to do that while we're getting underway? Because it would be really terrific to get the questions from you and have it as a conversation with these very interesting speakers. All right, so without further ado, as they say, let's get started. So our first speaker has come from interstate, which is so novel and lovely, isn't it? Yes. So Dr. Jemima Mowbray from the Tenants Union of New South Wales. Jemima, I'll just give you a little bit about Jemima, is the Manager of Policy and Advocacy at the Tenants Union of New South Wales, with extensive research experience in the university sector, working on projects on the politics of multiculturalism, most relevant for private rental multiculturalism, that's for sure, community and identity, also welfare policy. So Jemima has a Bachelor of Arts and a PhD from Sydney Uni, and she's very passionate about housing justice. She's a long-term renter and imagines that she'll be renting for life. I wonder why. Okay, Jemima, please come up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that lovely introduction. I too would like to acknowledge before I begin that we're on Aboriginal country today. This is the unceded country of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Wominjeka, hello, and thank you to Ahuri, and thank you to the conference organisers. As Heather mentioned, I've come from Sydney. I'm very excited to be down here in Melbourne. To be honest, I am very excited to be out of my house and having face-to-face conversations with you all about solutions, about what we've learnt from COVID, about resilience. So I'm just going to take a moment. I believe I just click. I'm really sorry. I thought I was going to be super straightforward. I'm not a seasoned presenter. Do I just click through on? I will just start. So when the COVID-19 health crisis first emerged in March 2020, the Tenants Union began very quickly, almost immediately. We began an in-house project monitoring a really rich source of internal data, and that's data about the advice and assistance provided by the network of New South Wales Tenants Advice and Advocacy Services. The Tenants Advice Services, we're a program of around 21 services. There are 2 resourcing bodies. We're one of those resourcing bodies, the Tenants Union of New South Wales, but there are also 19 other local services, and they give direct free tenancy advice. So we were looking at the data about matters or the nature of problems that people were calling us about, and we were also doing bi-monthly interviews with all the coordinators of those services. So we sat this alongside other available data, so that's things like fair trading bond data, so lodgements, but also the dispersal of bonds, and data about debts in other sectors, and also the visits that were coming to the tenants.org.au website. So what were the fact sheets people were downloading? What were the matters that people were really concerned about? And we wanted to draw a picture of what was happening for renters as a result of COVID. And very quickly, and this won't surprise any of you here, we identified eviction, the early ending of tenancies, and rent, problems with rent, as the key concerns that renters were experiencing. governments, including the New South Wales government, responded actually reasonably quickly. They recognised the need for emergency intervention, for emergency measures, and they brought in a framework of protections. Each jurisdiction did this slightly differently, and most of those were the majority of those protections were focused on restricting or preventing eviction. And emergency intervention of this kind was needed because our current tenancy laws and policy settings are not able to provide adequate protections for renting households who are struggling. Those interventions weren't perfect. There were a range of weaknesses and gaps. But in fairness, as a policy wonk, I absolutely appreciate it is very hard to get good policy. It's very hard to get good law very quickly, and this was developed very, very quickly. And so whatever their inadequacies, they provided vital support for renters through the pandemic. So as we emerged from 2 years of COVID, we didn't emerge from COVID, but we've now experienced 2 years of COVID. At the Tenants Union, we wanted to look back on what we had seen. We wanted to look back on the data that we'd been collecting and what the analysis that we'd been doing about what renters had been experiencing, and see what we could learn, how effective had those interventions been, what had been the problems that immediately arose, and what changes were needed to ensure we could build a more responsive, more crisis-resilient renting system in New South Wales going forward. So this led us to a deep dive into evictions. And earlier this month, we published a report, Evictions, Hardship and the Housing Crisis. So if anything in this talk sparks your interest, we explore in a lot more detail evictions, what they look like, their costs, and what we need to do, what we need to be doing to address the problems that arise when eviction is used and address our overuse of evictions. It is a substantial report. There are a couple of policy briefings that will be an entry point in if you don't have time to read 100 pages, which I absolutely appreciate. So I've got a couple of 2-page briefers and a couple of blogs on our tenants.org.au website that are also a good entry point into the report. So we wanted to look at the why and the how of eviction to assess their impact generally and look at what we can do going forward to actually sustain tenancies, to avoid eviction where possible. So I'm just going to ask, thank you very much. So these were the questions that emerged for us. This is what we wanted to explore as we started writing up the report. And before I take you to the key findings of our report, I'm just going to look a little bit about what some of the emerging data, so data that comes out after the event in some ways. That TAS data was a little bit real-time data, but we now have access to a bit more data. So on the next slide, I actually just want to run through what was it looking like for tenants during COVID. And so now we can actually draw on tribunal data. This is the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. It's worth noting here that only 1% of evictions actually get through and go through to tribunal. So this isn't the full picture, but it's a great lens on the kinds of disputes that were coming up. And I think what's really interesting if you look at this, it surprised me a little bit, was that there was a decrease in the number of applications or lodgements to about tenancy matters to the tribunal of around 10%, but actually in relation to private tenancies, we saw an increase of around 2%. So it basically stayed the same, the number of matters and the number of applications to tribunal. For social housing, the picture looks really different. Social housing providers were not applying to tribunal anywhere near as much, which is what brought that number down. So they decreased by around 35%. So if we can click over to the next slide, actually. So if you wanted to look at, this is the percentage of total NCAT matters that were actually relating to eviction. For the social housing list, the number of matters, the percentage of that relating to eviction remained about the same, but the numbers had substantially dropped. Just applications had dropped a whole lot. For the private rental list, you will see a drop of matters relating to eviction. Went from pre-COVID, 57%, to 45% of matters that were going to to NCAT were about eviction. So that is a drop, but it's not a substantial drop, really, given that in that period, July to December 2020, we had our first moratorium in place that was supposed to be about restricting evictions. If you dig a bit deeper to look at what kinds of evictions were taking place, there was a drop in termination for non-payment of rent in private rentals, a drop of around 28%. And so if you look at that and then look at the drop here, 57 to 45%, you have to work out, well, what's actually happening there? Why aren't we seeing a more significant drop if those restrictions have led to a drop in the rent arrears evictions? And in some ways, it's very clear that there was termination for other grounds being used by landlords. And really it's that plus bond disputes that account for the fact that we had the same number of applications to tribunal. And it's also clear that where landlords couldn't use termination for non-payment of rent, they were moving to use other kinds of termination, other grounds for termination. And in terms of the in-house research that we were doing, talking to coordinators, looking at our TAS data, that's the network of Tenants Advice Service data, it was clear that we were seeing an increased use of no grounds evictions, or in Victoria they call them no reason evictions, although you've just almost gotten rid of them. But I will just on social housing, I think it's worth pointing out, you did see this was a different picture. Social housing providers were actually exempt from the moratorium, but they brought in their own sort of de facto moratorium. And, they brought in their own de facto moratorium, essentially making sure that where there were arrears in place, they were going to work with the tenants and really decrease instalments, make it possible for renters to stay in their homes. And it's worth noting at the same time that incomes went up for most tenants in public and community housing. They had an increase in their income support, either increase in job seeker or they were receiving a supplement. That wasn't counted as income for the purposes of rent. And so they actually saw a decrease in their rent and they were having more money coming in. So of course rent arrears were dropping. And rent arrears are the primary thing that takes most providers, including public and community housing providers, to the tribunal. Alrighty, so next slide. I'm going to race through these. This is data from the TAS services, from the Tenants Advice Services, that shows you that what we've actually seen as well is if we go to the next slide, I'll come back to this one potentially, but we saw a really strong peak for calls in relation to issues relating to forced moves and relating to financial matters, so problems around rent. Early on in March, but we've actually seen a continued increase in the number of people who are calling us about eviction and who are calling us about problems relating to financial matters. They're struggling. So I think that makes a whole lot of sense for us, for anybody who's been in this housing space. We knew that there'd be an immediate impact, but we also knew that we were going to see the consequences of the impacts of that job loss, of the economic impacts. That was going to be a slow burn as well, and that we would continue to see increased circumstances of disadvantage. So because I'm limited in time, I'm going to just jump ahead to the next slide. What were the key findings of our report? I really encourage you to go and have a read of it. We found private renters in New South Wales move more often than their owner-occupier neighbours. A significant number of these moves are as a result of eviction. It's very expensive to move, and there are high costs involved in eviction. Really happy to talk about that up to 30% figure if people are interested where that comes from. So that's up to 30% of moves that tenants are making are as a result of a landlord-initiated termination or a forced move. The next slide. So we actually did we really wanted to investigate what does it cost everyone, really, when people are evicted. The first thing we focused on was that direct financial impact of the move. And there's a whole lot of detail. We did quite a lot looking at that journey, or that, I hate the word journey, but that that moment when you're forced to move from start to finish and what does it cost. We've weighted that by household type and by location, and we calculated it was around $4,000 as an average cost. It's not your basic move, but your average move that most people will see. $4,000 when a renting household has to move. It's worth noting that actually our estimate for this is very close to that of the New South Wales Treasury. So in 2019, the New South Wales Productivity Commission looked at what does it cost when somebody is evicted. They calculated, I think, $3,300 per household for each move. They had slightly higher costs for landlords, so I think it was around $1,600, $1,700 for a landlord. But both of our estimates would result in around $120 million each year as a cost to the New South Wales economy. So another really important part of what we considered in the report is who bears the cost of eviction. So of course, the renting household primarily carries the cost of any eviction. They pay the largest share of the immediate expenses, and they suffer the longer-term financial disadvantage and negative impacts on their health and employment and educational opportunities. Significantly though, and in the longer term, there are substantial additional costs imposed on governments where unnecessary eviction occurs, with increased demand and expenditure on a range of government services as a result of eviction. And this is especially the case where eviction leads to homelessness. So in our report, I know I'm probably running very short on time, so our next slide. In our report, we looked through a range of proposals that we think could firstly result in the discouraging of eviction. Why do we use eviction? Why do we rely on eviction in the way that we do? There are a range of ways when eviction occurs, it's completely unnecessary, and there are a range of ways that we could disincentivize or discourage eviction. But we also, for people who face termination, for rent arrears especially, it's worth noting they are at a higher risk of being evicted into homelessness. So as well as the immediate costs that are higher for them and very traumatic, there are substantial costs to government. What can we do to support them to sustain their tenancies? Essentially, we put forward a proposal about a permanent hardship framework that shifts when we intervene in crisis and how we intervene in crisis. Really happy to talk about the details of that in discussion, or we run through it in the report and in the briefings that I mentioned. We came up with a list of recommendations because that's what we do. We have lots of ideas. But what we really wanted to do with this report was open up an engaged and inclusive discussion, a conversation with government, with housing providers and landlords, with the community, with industry, about evictions and about our renting system and how we can do better. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jemima. That's incredible research, very timely, and I'm hoping that we have some questions about it that allow you to expand a little more. Look, the way we're running this is to have one substantial presentation, which is Jemima's and it will be Jennifer's, and a 5-minute response. So this first one is from Helen Tai from Bridge Housing and from my favourite, Homegrown Real Estate in Sydney. So take it away, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And I too am excited to be here and want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you, Jemima. There's some great recommendations in the report, and I want to state up front that in principle we agree with what you are proposing. So today I want to say that there's an existing base of ethical landlords who want to help address the housing crisis and are actively participating in a new, more sustainable model of property management. I want to bring your focus to 3 key areas. And I think I have to do something with this too. Oh, no, there we go. Already done, thank you. Homegrown Real Estate is a network of not-for-profit real estate agencies operating in Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne. We provide market and specialist affordable housing management for landlords, including developers, and we will skew the data presented by Jemima today. We operate as ethical landlords, and surplus made is reinvested in the supply of more affordable housing. I know this is not the norm, but it's a model that can advocate for change. During the pandemic, homegrown real estate networks were supported with rent reductions. We know during COVID that people in tenuous employment were hit harder than most, and that often tenants accessing affordable housing are managing their income from more than one job with insecure employment. So I'm very pleased to say the rent reductions across the homegrown network were offered to 100% of tenants who applied for them. And I can even report examples of landlords reducing the tenant's rent and not their management fee, which funds the surpluses, we hope, as a sign of their concern for the well-being of tenants during COVID. We actively promoted these rent reductions and other support via social media. I acknowledge these examples don't reflect what Jemima spoke about today. However, I think models like Homegrown Network can put in place strategies to support tenants through advocating to landlords before legislative changes take place. The Homegrown model helps change the way we think about rental housing and the relationship between tenants and landlords. Homegrown knows the value of sustaining tenancies for tenants, and landlords understand the financial benefits too. I agree with what Jemima said, that for tenants and landlords too, there are significant costs incurred in turning over a tenancy. For landlords, there are periods of vacancy and rent loss, costs of cleaning and upgrading property, advertising, and staff time to manage all these activities. With affordable housing, this includes finding the right tenant within the right income band. So overall, maintaining the tenancy and seeking a reduction if a tenant experiences some difficulty saves money and hardship for tenants. A rent reduction of $100 per week for 12 weeks is only $1,200, when a vacancy from our costs and calculations is between $3,000 to $5,000 for a landlord. So reducing that rent and keeping the tenant makes sense for the landlord too. Homegrown has a role to play to continue to educate landlords on the value of long-term sustainable relationships with tenants. Homegrown can advocate on behalf of tenants with landlords to deliver positive outcomes for renters and landlords. Jemima's presentation identifies clearly that private rental tenants can be negatively impacted by landlord decisions, including decisions such as issuing no-ground termination notices, increasing rent charges, and not renewing lease agreements due to program requirements, even within affordable housing. The Homegrown Network can provide examples of where we have advocated on behalf of tenants to offer alternate management solutions to landlords with fairer impacts for tenants. For example, deferring rent increases to enable an existing tenant to plan and prepare for this change. Seeking an extension to affordable housing lease agreement when a tenant is unable to relocate, or enabling an affordable housing tenant to relocate within programs to access the best support for them, and breaking leases without penalty where there is due cause. Overall, Bridge Housing and the Homegrown Network stand beside the Tenants' Union proposal for improved outcomes for private rental tenants through changes in legislation. We understand the housing crisis is negatively impacting some, like those on low incomes and in insecure employment, more than others. And while the Homegrown Network and other similar agencies operating as ethical landlords provide some protection, more is needed to create that sustained change. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, it really comes into its own at times like that, doesn't it? Very interesting, thank you. Our next speaker is Jennifer Beveridge, the CEO of Tenants Victoria. So Jennifer's been the CEO there since June of 2019. How time does pass, yes. So there's not been a normal day probably in the office since then with the bushfires and the pandemic, of a huge kind of residential tenancies legislation change. But I'll let you tell everybody about that, Jen. Welcome.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks to everyone for coming to hear the story of how things have been here in Victoria for the last couple of years. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today and pay my respects to elders past and present, as it is right to do when we enter anybody's home, that we acknowledge that we are visiting somebody's home. So I want to talk about resilience for renters, ensuring their homes are safe, secure havens during the COVID-19 pandemic. And no, this is not working either. And that's it. Thank you. So I've really got a story to tell. Jemima shared a whole lot of data. I have a few numbers, but really I'd like to engage you with the story from a renter's perspective. Just a little bit of background. Unlike the Tenants' Union of New South Wales, Tenants Victoria is in the business of providing services to renters, as well as doing some policy work and advocacy work. We are part of the Community Legal Centre network, and we provide legal services to somewhere between 10 and 15,000 renters every year. And so we know and we believe that housing is a basic human right. During the last couple of years, we've made quite a lot of changes at Tenants Victoria. For those who haven't kept up with it, we used to be the Tenants Union of Victoria. We're now Tenants Victoria. We've changed our logo. We have a new strategic plan, and we've recast our vision as a safe, secure and affordable home for every Victorian renter in a fair housing system. So we absolutely believe that everybody has the right to safe housing. And the story I want to tell you, though, doesn't have a happy ending. The end of the story, as it is today, is that resilience is in short supply in a system that's inherently disadvantaging. And if we stop and think about what does it mean that housing is a basic human right, I'm sure everyone in this room agrees with that. But have we ever really stopped and thought about what it would mean if we didn't have a home? People in New South Wales are facing that right now. Home is a place of security, of solace from the world, and from where we engage with the world and thrive. A lot of us, particularly here in Melbourne, have spent many days where 23 hours of a 24-hour day we have been stuck at home. Disruption is a common experience for renters. It's nothing new. Renters live with the idea that at any point in time they might need a repair, they might be issued with a rent increase or a notice to vacate. The repair might be a broken fence. How do you keep your pet in the yard when the fence or the gate's broken? No hot water service. How do you shower? And how do you provide meals for your family if the stove is broken? So disruption is nothing new. But during the pandemic, we had a whole new cohort of renters who experienced this disruption they never expected to. And they were new to help seeking. They were scrambling to find a way to keep the roof over their head. So following on from Jemima, I want to talk about the two lots of laws that have been implemented here in Victoria over the last couple of years. And you'd think that the laws are in place and that they would serve people well. At Tenants Victoria, that's not been our experience. And we're talking more and more about the need for not just law reform, but a shift in attitudes. This requires the whole sector to come and think about renting differently. We have regular engagement with renters through our legal service, through our website and social media, and through a number of intentional surveys that we conducted during the pandemic to take the pulse check. Let's go. I'll give you some of the details. And essentially what we're talking about is that safe and secure housing relies on an interplay between cultural factors, between the law and between socio-economic factors. So like New South Wales, here in Victoria, we had an eviction moratorium. That was also happened very, very quickly. We were involved with a number of other organisations in advocating for that, in providing advice into the decision-making process, looking at draft legislation, regulations. It was an absolute whirlwind. And so we ended up with a package of support for renters here in Victoria. There were to be no rent increases. There were to be no notices to vacate, except in exceptional circumstances. And there were definitely to be no evictions for rent arrears. We had another system that was put in place, which was through Consumer Affairs Victoria, where renters and landlords were assisted to negotiate rent reductions and, if needed, to proceed to dispute resolution. All in all, there were about 75,000 rent reductions registered with Consumer Affairs over this time. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And the other package was the rent relief grant that was available to be paid to the landlord. This was administered through our Human Services Department, which changed its name midway through to Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. There was a second lot of money available towards the end of 2021 as we continued with our world-beating lockdowns. And there's a graph here. So one of the key insights that we found through our first survey was that 1 in 5 people who responded to the survey, and there were about 700 people who responded, didn't even ask for a rent reduction. About 10% of those had no financial need, but over 60% gave reasons of fear, confusion, and based on past experience with their property manager or their landlord, they thought it would be unlikely. Many people talked about the retribution that they feared would come their way. Only 2% of people who responded to our survey, so unlike Helen's 100%, only 2% replied that they'd been offered a rent reduction. So this is the laws in place, providing the guidance, and still we weren't seeing the evidence of that. Of those people who did ask for a rent reduction, more than 60% were ignored, they were denied, or delaying tactics were used to just string out so that they would give up. 5% were given financial advice on how to, improve things, and 12% were offered a deferral. Now, a deferral wasn't something that was in the legislation, and yet that was still offered to them. So day after day, week after week, we continued to get emails, comments on social media that were heartbreaking, and to be honest, I had to stop reading them. It was there were many times that I cried because I couldn't believe the experience that people were having. And these quotes up here are just a sample of the tone of the experience that people were having when the laws were in place to prevent evictions. So you may have heard that there was a great new law coming in Victoria, and it was due to be implemented on the 1st of July in 2020. It actually stumbled into operation at the end of the eviction moratorium in March 2021. And the intent all along was to improve the rights of renters. Now, somehow, we'd had a great time with the eviction moratorium in the previous 12 months. And so we were looking forward, perhaps with a little less enthusiasm about what these new laws would bring. There were 132 changes, and for those of you not familiar with it, for the first time minimum standards were required in rental properties. Some repairs were reclassified as needing to be attended to urgently. Pets were allowed. There were a number of family violence provisions. The no reason notice to vacate was abolished, and there was a new reasonable and proportionate test that was to be applied. However, as you know, Melbourne is an award-winning city around the world that we had the longest lockdown ever. So by the time these laws came into place, we'd already had 3 lockdowns, totalling 159 days. And we were advocating that there should be some more protections to manage the COVID situation. There were some transitional measures that were put in place for 6 months after the introduction of the new laws, but it was believed that the new laws would support people who were impacted by COVID in an ongoing way. In fact, Melbourne had a further 103 days in lockdown to come, and they were finally lifted at the end of October, just days before these transitional measures ended. So the continuing impact of the pandemic wreaked havoc for renters here in Victoria. There were delays in VCAT, partly because there were many more disputes, partly because they too were struggling with the impact of COVID on their workforce and their systems and processes. And there were continuing poor standards of housing. Again, another set of quotes from renters. And really what this shows is that the COVID experience exacerbated situations that were already dire for many renters. So clearly more than laws are needed. Another survey we did showed some hotspots where people were experiencing rental stress, and this highlighted to us a whole new cohort of people who we hadn't even had contact with. So lots of people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities who were living in the fringes of Melbourne. They weren't working, they'd lost income, they were unable to pay their rent. The situation was bad for them. So the chronic effects in an already stressed housing system were lingering, and the reliance on the laws weren't having the expected impact. So some of the things that we believe we need more of is increased tenancy literacy for renters. We need more direct engagement with CALD communities, and we need more dispute resolution mechanisms like we'd had during the eviction moratorium when Consumer Affairs had facilitated mediation and dispute resolution. We also believe that we need training for property managers and rental providers because the intent of these new laws was to improve the rights for renters and to have some mechanisms in place that would create security for people, but that's not happening. One of the things that we talk about is that with the new legislation, we don't talk about landlords anymore, they're residential rental providers, and we would like residential rental providers to understand that they're in the business of providing housing for people. Again, some more quotes from people. Yeah, I think I've got 2 slides, Heather. I'll whip through them. And so on it goes. We've now got people moving in search of cheaper rents and more space. We've got rental vacancy rates that are skew-if. Flats in inner Melbourne are easy to come by, but homes for families are really difficult, particularly in regional areas. And there's a new risk of homelessness that's not ever been seen before, with new cohorts of people. And a graph here that just highlights the variability of vacancy rates in the 3 major cities in Australia. So what next? So what next? As Jemima pointed out, there are financial costs to both the renter and the rental provider every time people move, and when houses are not maintained. There are social costs in a system where renters are really fair game. We want to see the law embedded in practice. And we're not seeing that yet. It may be clouded or delayed because of the pandemic, or it may be that people have no intention of complying. Such things as minimum standards continue to come to us at Tenants Victoria. Sewage running through people's houses, roofs that have been damaged in storms that nobody's even done a temporary repair on, and the water's shorting out the electrical circuits. Mould is an ongoing problem, and we piloted a clinic in winter that was completely overwhelmed by demand. The VCAT backlog, family violence issues are to be heard within days, but it's taking them weeks to be heard. So there's a long tail of COVID in the legal process. And we need to improve our understanding of renting as a viable long-term housing offered. I'll just flip through this. So we can no longer, as a housing sector, disregard the fact that renting is a permanent fixture in our housing sector. That previous slide, the decline in home ownership has dropped to 66%. That means that there are over 30% of people who are looking to renting as a viable option for them and their families for their housing. So it's our challenge to improve our practice of providing safe, secure and affordable housing for all. We need renting to be a dignified option for renter and rental provider alike. Here in Victoria, rental providers are an active part of the housing system. They're not landlords anymore. They're not passive investors in property. As their name suggests, they are providers of housing. And so if I return to my earlier statement that housing is a basic human right, then why do we treat those people who rent so badly? Why do we perpetuate a system that is inherently disadvantaging? Because, as the pandemic has shown, anyone can find themselves in difficulty. And as Jane reminded us earlier, a society that doesn't look after one of us may one day not look after me. And so, let's start looking after our renters, because surely we can do better than we're doing at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Now, to give the response, we've got Leah Calnan. Leah has had a long association with the Real Estate Institute of Victoria, including as the immediate past president and for 2 terms. Leah is started it as an assistant property manager, but is now the proprietor and director of Metro Property Management. So, and has been very involved, I must say, in a lot of the policy debates as well. So welcome, Leah, and over to you.
Thanks, Heather. I'm certainly outnumbered, that is for sure. Okay. All right, so I wanted to start, obviously, that the rental market is no longer one-dimensional. The rental market has changed. You know, people rent for lifestyle reasons. People move more frequently. People try before they buy. They live in a hybrid work environment now. And investors buy property to support their superannuation and the requirements they receive from government and planning for their future. Properties come in all shapes and sizes, from one-bedroom studio apartments to Turex multi-million-dollar homes to large family homes across acreage in regional Victoria. Okay, can we jump to the next slide? Maybe? Okay, great, thank you. So according to the ATO, there is approximately 2.05 million property investors in Australia. 89.7% of renters rent from private rental providers. So let me say that again, 89.7%. So of that 89.7%, there are 71.8% that own one investment property. They have a taxable income of under $80,000 per annum. And approximately 67% of rental properties are leased and managed through a real estate agent. So in the current environment, we see a strong trend of property owners selling their investment properties. But the problem with that is that the properties don't return to the supply of rentals, which will ultimately result in higher rents, lower vacancy rates, and a serious shortage supply, which is absolutely brewing. We need to also consider that prior to the pandemic, we saw around 120,000 people migrate to Victoria per year. So with a shortage of rental supply coming in, where are we going to house these people? Next slide, thank you. So with 71% of residential investors owning one property, the majority of them actually didn't meet the threshold to qualify for the 25% land tax rebate that was offered by government. Mortgages, yes, they were deferred, but they were put on hold. The investors still had to pay. Some tenants, and I apologise, I cannot get renters and tenants usually in the same slides at the same time. I'm old school in that space. Some tenants simply stopped paying the rent, or they didn't apply for the government assistance because they had savings greater than the threshold that was actually set. Overnight, all of our worlds were turned upside down. Renters received financial assistance from the government not once but twice. Investors were simply expected to reduce the rent and do the right thing, irrespective of their own financial impact in their own personal lives. Some renters who experienced no reduction in hours, no financial loss put their hand out for rent reductions. Owners had limited choices at that time because rental vacancy rates continued to increase. The VCAT system imploded and is still under-resourced and has significant delays. And as Jennifer mentioned, to give you perspective there, applications for tenants' bonds back in March 2020 are still sitting in the system. So it's not just renters that are affected in these circumstances, it is also the providers. Next slide, please. 1,700 more social houses are needed every year to maintain the social housing at today's numbers. And social housing makes up 3.5% of the current housing supply in Victoria, which all governments should be embarrassed about. There needs to be an increase of over 30,000 social homes over the next 20 years. Australia will find itself 163,400 homes short of this expected demand, which on average the deficit is that $20,000 per year. This highlights the need that the private sector cannot be expected to continue to do all of the heavy lifting. So when we talk about the social housing requirements, to give you we've talked about some stories today. I'm a practicing property manager. I have a tenant who's been in a property for a few years, had a marriage breakdown, is in his second time of falling into arrears. His rent is paid to early December. There is a process underway for not an unauthorised eviction, but an eviction process for non-payment of rent. The renter in my conversations, so my conversations where I've been doing this for nearly 30 years, he says to me, I'm on a hunger strike, Leah, because I'm going to kill myself on Friday. We've had continual suicide threats from him. He has painted the exterior of his house in notes. There are severe mental health challenges out there, and whilst it's very easy to point fingers about who's responsible, it's the property managers who are not trained in this space who manage those incoming calls. He's currently being relocated to care, and ultimately the advice that we've had from the government intervention that we've gone through is that his tenancy is no longer suitable and he actually needs to be evicted. There are many stories like that, and I think sometimes too often we only hear it from one side. Next slide, please. So to give you some indication of that the private supply challenges. So yes, in March last year we saw 130 changes in legislation. We've seen approximately 40% of the property management industry leave. Just like all other sectors, we're doing it tough as well. In September last year, which was just great timing, and potentially government could have changed this, we saw the introduction of higher education requirements, which sees the entry level into real estate go from 3 modules to 18 modules. And whilst we all, from tenant union to government to REIV to me as a business owner, want to see higher education, the impact on that to obtain staff and train them is horrendous. It is only going to get worse. In the past 10 years, the median house rent has only increased by 26%, and the current return is lower than it was 10 years ago. So why would you be an investor? The median house price has almost doubled. So why wouldn't they sell? We saw the introduction of new compliance costs and holding costs such as land tax. Land tax continues to grow, and it's a great income to government, but again, it's another reason why investors will leave this market. Next slide. So a national housing conference where 5 minutes is dedicated to talk about the private rental provider who supply accommodation to almost 90% of renters. Too often the supply sector is blamed for the results, but they're never asked to be part of the solution. It's not our role to provide social and or community housing, yet government continually comes up with funding programs which require the private sector to support and engage. Private rental providers, they must be considered. They must be part of the discussion, otherwise there will be no genuine reduction in the rental stress that is out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. We're going to give you a bit longer than 5 minutes because we've got you up on the stage now. So, yeah. Could I invite the other speakers to come up as well? Thanks everybody who's already sent in their questions. But if you've got anything you would like asked, do add that. That would make us, much richer, good conversation. So we've got a good half hour now for this. So let's get started. Here are the 2 mics. So let's go shares. No, I think I'll do it from here. Actually, I was dithering around, but yeah. So the first question is a brass tacks one. So hang on, I've got your attention, but okay. If 71% of investors earn under 80K a year, this I think is probably going to be for you, Leah, because that's your stat. Isn't this a function of negative gearing? Asks the questioner. Good?
Yeah, it is a function on negative gearing, but if cash flow doesn't allow for the investor to hold the property, then they're not going to hold it for an extended period of time. And when you've got a strong housing market where it's actually more beneficial to sell out, then the challenge with that is that those properties don't return.
Jemima, do you want to say something in addition to that? Is that what's going on there?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Is this, yeah. I was just going to mention, I think it actually flags to us something that's really concerning. I hear your concern about the hardship that landlords face, especially when something comes up like this, when there are additional expenses, when it's unexpected. But we actually see it outside of something like a health crisis. Certainly we'll see it up in the floods, you know, in Lismore, in Queensland. We saw it in bushfires in New South Wales. There were providers of housing, landlords, who didn't have the cash flow to actually, when something happened, didn't necessarily have insurance either, to actually do the work to the property that was required to bring it back up to a livable, safe standard. And I think we actually see that outside of COVID, outside of crisis circumstances. The picture that Jen painted of what it looked like through COVID in terms of people calling in, that's exactly what we saw in New South Wales as well. But we see it outside of COVID as well. We have lots of calls. Most of our calls are about repairs and maintenance, or a lot of our calls are about repairs and maintenance. Whenever there's rain, it's about mould. But the landlord has said, we don't have the cash flow to do the repairs that you need. And I think that stat is actually really concerning. It's not just about what will happen when they leave. It's about who's coming in, who's being encouraged to come in, who's being told that property is the way that you can build your super, such that they put themselves in a financially unsustainable position. They can't weather the risk. And that's a real problem for our system. But we can't keep saying, renters, because landlords don't have the cash, you don't have the right to safe, secure housing.
Thanks, Jemima. Actually, Helen, can I invite Helen to say something there too, because you're representing what I think are slightly differently motivated landlords, or a section with a particular motivation.
Yeah, look, I think the sector has, and that being ethical landlords and real estate agents, have a role to educate property owners about the costs if property owners are uninformed about those ongoing costs. Certainly we have modelling information that we have for ourselves about how we manage our own assets, and that information no doubt is available broadly to others. So yes, if people need to sell on their capital because they can't manage it and maintain it, then that's what they need to do. I don't think it's a risk for the property owner. You know, it's a risk to let the property deteriorate. It's not going to be fit for service. They are providing housing as a service as such, so it needs to be maintained.
Jennifer wants to have something to say too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't like missing out.
No,
ever.
you won't. That's right.
But I think it comes back to this bigger question, and that is that so let's not see housing or residential property as an investment. It may be an investment, but like any other business that you invest in to make money, there is a cost as part of it, and that needs to be factored in. Whatever business people own or run, there's an income stream and there are costs. And I think it's about shifting that cultural perspective on this, that, I'll buy... I hear young people say, oh, I'm going to buy a flat because I've got some money and I'll just rent it out. And so, I'm there saying, well, actually, you need to be able to cover your costs. Have you got enough income? You can't just rent it out because that won't cover all of the costs.
Thanks, everybody. Look, there's a few... You really got everyone hopping, actually, Leah, so good work. No, that's right. So, look, the next one is... Travis, g'day from Canberra, Travis. While it may not be the job of amateur landlords to provide social housing, is it unreasonable to expect a social outcome in return for more than $11 billion worth of foregone tax revenue? So this is where, well, that's the question. Do you want to take that?
I can't win either way, can I? I think the point that I really want to get across is that there has to be a continual focus on that social housing component.
Yeah.
You'll always have you'll always have a private rental market. And, in my experience as a PM, the majority of owners do the right thing. The majority of tenants, renters, do the right thing. It's those ones that don't, that we all talk about. It's those ones on both sides. So I think you just cannot continue to rely on the private rental sector to continually pick up the housing requirements across either Victoria or across Australia. I think that is really what I'm trying to get across.
Yep, we might have a Unity ticket at last. Look, I'm going to ask a related question before I let others have a go there, which is the problem that private rental is supplied by mum and dad investors, and should the system involve corporate investors? The market is not designed to provide ongoing rentals. There's an inherent, design issue there. Jemima, perhaps.
Yeah, happy to. So one of the things that I wanted to, I think there's real agreement, Leah. I think absolutely.
Swaps? No, we won't.
But I'm aware that hearing that tech is very good, very hearing impaired. But for the minute.
Step up here while he comes up and fixes it. Yeah. That's right.
I think we're all in very strong agreement that we need government subsidised housing to address housing affordability. I think that would have a really great flow-on effect into the private rental market in terms of affordability, in terms of the standards of properties that were being rented, especially to low-income households. So there's a role for government in actually significantly investing in public and community housing. One of the things that we talk about in the report that I mentioned is housing as an essential service. So we're very familiar with talking about it as critical infrastructure or essential infrastructure, building the properties, building the supply of stock. But I think there's also this service of access to housing, and that's a really important service. And I think absolutely we need government to be building the public and community housing to address this chronic lack of affordable housing. I think we're absolutely in agreement there. And also, when we've talked about in the report, we talk about a permanent hardship framework. It's not appropriate to put in place a permanent hardship framework or support people when they're in crisis and then think if you're facing chronic disadvantage, that short period is going to help you out. What we're really talking about there is a lot of times you can maybe hold off or stop the chronic disadvantage by actually supporting somebody for a shorter period and helping them sustain their housing so that they can get everything back together. But in terms of chronic disadvantage, we need that government subsidised housing. So I think the other thing that you mentioned was around whether or not it's corporate entities that need to step in to take over from the amateur landlords. We haven't seen that actually work in other jurisdictions internationally. In fact, I think in Germany, they very recently had the referendum to say, this is not working, we're taking back the housing that got shifted across to corporate landlords because it's not delivering what we hoped it would deliver. And so you see actually that people are saying, market isn't delivering, market isn't doing what we need it to do, government has to step in and actually take seriously their role in making sure people have access to this essential service.
Okay, thanks. Crisis weathered there. We've got our mics back as well. Look, another question around supply of private rental. This questioner says, I've heard that owners are taking their properties off the private rental market as changes to legislation have made the market riskier for owners. Do you consider this an issue for private rental availability? Actually, let's start with you, Helen, on that one. Are you hearing anything along those lines?
No. Can you hear? No? Hello?
This one works.
Can you hear?
Come stand up here. Yeah.
No, I'm not hearing anything. I think the vacancy rates in Sydney are still quite tight from a New South Wales perspective, and certainly there's no indication that that properties being withheld and not being leased to the market. So we also, as a community housing provider, have a very large portfolio of properties we rent from the private rental market to augment supply of social housing. So that hasn't been an issue in New South Wales.
Leo, would you like to see if you can get the microphone to work on that one? Yeah?
Is it working?
Just go straight up.
Yeah, so see that? That works. That doesn't work. No TA.
No. It's equal opportunity game. Come up here.
Yeah, absolutely. There is owners leaving the rental market in droves, and I can say that from a business owner, where from a rent roll that I have, we'd probably see 5 to 10 clients sell a month, and that's just in my business. And it's not a reflection directly on the legislation. It's a combination of a myriad of things, from COVID, from their financial position, partly from the obligations and now the costs required to meet some level of compliance. There are some old properties that will never be compliant, and for example, it might sound silly, but that might be the owners needing to renovate part of their kitchen because their range hood no longer meets compliance, but it did when it was built 25 years ago. But there is absolutely an exit of investors out there.
I'm sorry that I always have something to say, but so this is actually something that we looked at a little bit, because in the report we try and address what can we do to offset some of the costs that might come up if we were to implement some stronger hardship protections. But we also wanted to address this concern that gets raised, and I think it's a valid concern, of what happens if investors leave the market in droves when we regulate, when we provide greater rights to renters. So we looked at what's existing, what's available in terms of the data on this. New Zealand saw some changes a couple of years ago. They're still being changes announced and some implementation. I think the data here in Victoria is a little bit too early to look at, but you didn't see substantial numbers of investors leaving. Uhuri Research that's done a comparator of very similar private rental markets, so places like Germany, across Europe, so a range of sort of similar or comparable private rental markets in Europe, and they found that the levels of regulation did not affect, they weren't a substantial contributor to whether or not the levels of investment by even amateur or the landlords who are only owning 1 or 2 properties. And I think also there's been research here in Australia done in 2009, but then I think CoreLogic did more research again, or did a profile of landlords across Australia in 2018, and they looked at what are the motivations of landlords who are investing in the private rental market. I think we can tell actually by the amount of rental loss or the negative gearing that is accessed, that most landlords aren't in it for the rental income initially. They are in it for the capital gains at the end. So that's the main reason they're investing. They're hoping for capital gains at the end of the investment, and that regulation of the rental market is not a key consideration for them in terms of that capital gains that they will get. So they don't look at regulation and go, well, I will invest or I won't invest. So I absolutely hear Leah's concerns, and I hear that anecdotally she is hearing of people who are concerned and leaving the market. But in terms of the data that's available in terms of how landlords respond, it doesn't actually play out that greater regulation leads to investors leaving the market in droves.
Thanks, Jemima. Sorry about this microphone situation. We'll do our best with it. Look, one other contributor, I'll say this is almost like an observation. If landlords are leaving the market, then why hasn't investor finance increased, suggesting that others are willing to take their place? I might actually go into a related one, which is around the pressure on regional markets, because what we're also seeing, I think, is a real, a lot of movement. People who might own for investment, waiting for their price to be right and then selling. That's one type of movement. But this movement out of the city centres is another one. So there's a question here, which I'll just scroll and hope I find. Of course, it's jammed on me. Sorry about that. With extremely low availability of rentals in some regional communities, do we see regional renters worse or better off with respect to the quality of housing? So that's a kind of a double question, I guess. Jen, do you want to say what you've been seeing at Tenants Victoria around the regional question and the quality question in regional areas?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Yeah, look, we're seeing this a lot at the moment, and interestingly, the country media is onto this. People who are in dire situations are kind of reaching out for whatever help that they can find. So, yes, there are lots of people, and particularly here in Victoria, where Victorians have had 2 years of working remotely and they have chosen to leave. I know I have a number of personal contacts who've moved from the inner city of Melbourne and they've gone into the country and they've permanently relocated there. So initially that was on a rental basis. Some of them have now bought, some are staying there as longer term rentals. So for every Melburnian who takes their secure income so that they can move to regional Victoria to work from home, they are displacing somebody who has been a long-term renter in that location. And it's not just down on the surf coast, it's in country towns like Horsham, it's in places like Mildura. So they're not the usual holiday locations. Central Victoria is terrible, up around Bendigo, the vacancy rates are really, really low up there. And so I think that naturally leads on to the quality issue, because if the housing's not available, and let's face it, the good things always go, even at morning tea, the good things go first. If you're in there and you've got the means, either being punctual or having more money, you get first dibs on things. And so inevitably the quality is poorer as there is less choice available for people. And we're talking in regional Victoria often about people who choose to live there because it's cheaper, who may have large families and who choose to live there because it's easier to have a bit more land, you're closer to some of the amenities. If you're a family who's spent your life building things up around a community and suddenly there's no housing for you, where do you go? So I think the two are inextricably linked.
Thanks, Jen. Would anyone else like to say anything about that regional question? Because I know it's not just happening in Victoria. I understand it's happening, throughout the states. Don't have to, but yeah. Thanks, Helen.
I can't say anything about the experience of regional New South Wales except to support what Jennifer said earlier, that obviously units in the city became available in the early parts of the pandemic, and certainly for us securing property in that part of the city was easier in early parts of the pandemic. Sydney being Sydney, that's moved around quite quickly after about 6 months, but certainly there was evidence that people in New South Wales were moving into regional areas as well. So we weren't operating in those regional centres, but that's our understanding too.
Oh.
So we actually have some of our local Tenants Advice Service advocates here in the room who were across in New England and Western New South Wales, and we've got advocates across all of New South Wales, and absolutely the regional areas are hit so hard at the moment in New South Wales. We were hearing from advocates about people who were calling in, had absolutely nowhere to go. We're calling in, I think this is in UTAS, so correct me if I'm wrong, Tamara, but we're calling to actually see if they could get storage in the ACT because they had nowhere to go and there was no storage locally to them. So they were having to look to where they could actually just store their furniture, store their belongings while they tried to find, and essentially were homeless, were staying with friends, were staying in cars. We had people calling up talking about putting a tent up next to the river. Up in the north, we're aware that some of the specialist homelessness services were so short of any kind of accommodation, they were actually giving out tents. That's what we heard anecdotally. I don't have any reason to doubt that. And that's had a really big impact also for, obviously, it's very traumatic for the families and the households hit by that, but it's actually had a really traumatic impact for our advocates. In the Illawarra, we had a service that actually had to deal with very significant mental health issues. And so I feel a lot of sympathy, and I hear you, Leah, when you're talking about getting those calls from people who are very distressed about their housing. And actually, in response to that, when we published the report, we had a lot of property managers who contacted us to say, actually, we do understand this problem with eviction because we're the front line. We're the ones who have to talk to the household. We're the ones who have to work out how to help that family find alternative accommodation, because there are a lot of good property managers, and if you're a long-term renter, you've probably established something of a relationship with that property manager, and so they feel the trauma of not being able to find any alternative accommodation. So it's a really hard situation at the moment. And just that other thing around standards and quality, I think it's also the case, and Jen kind of gestured to this, that people, it's not just about the quality of the property they can get, they just have whatever property they can get, they're going to move their family into. And so you're seeing really unsuitable properties. Maybe the property itself is fine, but you've got a lot of overcrowding, it's not accessible for a range of reasons, but it's the only property they could get. And so landlord can't do very much to improve it, but there just isn't, I suppose, the diverse nature of housing that is required to safely house that family.
Okay, thank you. One more sort of slightly technical or specific question. This is around the substantial abolition of the no reason notice to vacate. So this has happened in Victoria except for at the end of the first tenancy. There's still an entitlement for an property owner to give a no reason notice to vacate, but otherwise it's been taken off. Particularly, I think this questioner is interested in the Queensland experience because that failed to get up after quite a lot of optimism that it would. So the question is, what impacts have there been on the Victorian market of the abolishment of the no reason notice to vacate? Because in Queensland the argument was made that that this would cause mass divestment of by owners. So has anyone, probably the Victorians, maybe this one's first for you, Leah, is it too early yet to say anything about the no reason notice to vacate, or have you got some observations on that?
No, you can see it now. So yeah, with the removal of the no reason notice, which at that stage, oh God, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like, it was a 120-day notice, wasn't it? Yeah. So what now happens, to be completely frank, is that there is a performance review of the tenancy that takes place at about 6 to 7 months that the property manager and the owner will conduct. And if the tenancy is not performing to the satisfaction of the owner and the property manager, then there is a high likely that the end of tenancy notice will be issued. And the reason for that is once that fixed term lease expires, there is no other option for that owner to end that relationship unless they decide to immediately sell the property, potentially renovate, which is still having some challenges in that VCAT space, demolish or change its availability or availability. So there is a fair amount of strategy that is now put in place in that private rental sector so that there is not a relationship that is continuing when there was an opportunity to end it.
The actual numbers of no reason notices that came to VCAT were always very low, interestingly. Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure if that helps you, Queensland, or not. But yeah. Look, the next bundle of questions, and we're starting to get towards time, so I'm just going to say that it's clear that people are being housed in private rental who ideally, I think there's consensus, would have social housing available to them, or would certainly have more support available to them in their private rental. And I think there's consensus probably that a lot of individual owners are getting into situations that are very hard for them to deal with. The example that Leah gave in her talk being one of them. That's hard for a community housing agency to deal with too, actually, that sort of one. So any thoughts that I'd just invite you as the last run through, one at a time, one each, about, well, that is the fact of the matter, that a lot of Australians are renting privately in housing that, probably is only just meeting their needs, or, so is there anything in the current settings that property management could have at their disposal to help with that, or what are your thoughts on that particular predicament? Just to give you a nice easy one to end with. Helen, do you want to start because you're closest to the mic?
I think from the lessons from the Homeground Network is that we have a role to play in advocating to landlords, and as property managers and agents, that's our role, to educate them around the requirements to support what function they're delivering as a housing provider and a housing service. So however that's an educative process, I think, to probably steal another one would be legislative changes to support, their requirement to educate their staff appropriately. So, yeah.
Thanks, Helen. Jemima, let's just do it in order.
I think from the New South Wales perspective, Victoria has actually taken a really great step in getting rid of no grounds or no reason eviction. I'm actually really sad to hear that initial ability that's left remaining in Victoria. We were really concerned when we heard that was still there, that you could still use a no reason eviction just within the first fixed term, because we had very grave concerns that landlords would turn around and do exactly what I suppose Leah has been describing, where they look at the tenancy and go, well, I don't know if I like you very much, I don't know if you're the perfect tenant for me, I'm going to kick you out, and not extend this tenancy to give you greater protection. Because I disagree. I think that there are actually a lot of reasons in Victorian tenancy law, and there certainly would be if we were to remove no grounds in New South Wales tenancy law and insert some additional provisions. But already in New South Wales, and certainly in Victoria, if you breach the contract, if you don't pay rent, if you damage the tenancy, damage the property, if you're a public, if you make a whole lot of noise and you disrupt your neighbours, there's a whole range of ways that you can end tenancies. And in Victoria, additional reasons, I'm not sure if additional reasons were inserted. I think they might have been, and certainly we're talking about inserting additional reasonable grounds if we were to have tenancy law change up in New South Wales. I think that's key, and I'll tell you why. First of all, it would improve our security. I've experienced a no grounds eviction. In fact, I was coordinating a no grounds campaign, pushing the legislation through Parliament. It finally, or looking to see if government would consider getting rid of no grounds, finally gets to Parliament. I literally couldn't tweet about it on the day, like you do as a campaigner. You want to do that because I was moving, because I just received a no grounds eviction. So would love to see that change, because you don't know when you're going to get moved on, but more importantly, just the threat of it means you do not feel confident to assert your rights. So we can have all of the other rights that we want. We could have a beautiful permanent hardship framework in place. We do have actually quite strong repairs rights in New South Wales, but we cannot assert them because we could be evicted for being a pesky tenant, and they might just not extend our lease. So I'd love to see that change.
Now, Jemima, it's your right to have had a go at the last question, not the one before, but anyway. So, Jen, anything about that question of, how can property managers be supported to do their best in circumstances?
Yeah, look, I think what we've seen is increasing complexity. I've worked in health, in mental health, and now in community legal service. And one of the things that I've noticed over my 30-year professional life is that clients' needs are becoming more and more complex. And I think it's unrealistic for us to expect people who aren't trained or who aren't supported to manage the intense complexity. And so this is where we come back to this idea that property management is not just about managing the property, it's actually about providing a service. It's about the people. You know, one of the things that frustrates me about so many things to do with housing and tenancy is that we keep putting pictures of houses and buildings. It's not about the building, it's about the people who live in the building and make that their home. And so even for trained people to deal with complex situations with people who have maybe a mental health episode, or maybe long-term mental illness or family breakdown, or all of these things that make our lives really difficult and push us into that situation where we need more support. Even people who are trained to do that need to debrief, need to have continuing professional development, need to be supported to manage how they deal with those difficult situations. And so I come back to, not an onerous professional development program for real estate agents and property managers, rental providers, but actually something that helps them and supports them to engage with the people who are making their home in the walls and the roof that they are managing ostensibly, but it's actually it's all about people and it's all about relationship. And again, going back to what Jane Caro said, it's about building the connection so that we can change things and make the world a better place.
Thanks, Jen. Now, I've given you the last minute, Leah, because you're okay. You've said what you need to say. Yeah, okay. Look, thanks, everybody, for contributing to that discussion and making it so engaged. There were a couple of questions we didn't get to, but I hope that in some of the presentations and remarks you heard some of the things that went at least some way towards answering those questions for you. So it's just for me to declare the session finished, and there was something about the morning tea and getting in for the best biscuits early, so I reckon that's the next order, hey, off to lunch. Thanks, everybody.